Hunter, who do you think produces the most amount of wheat today? Or at least, I guess, in recent years.
What country?
What country? Yes. What country?
Ooh, that's a tough one. There's a bunch to pick from. I'm going to guess maybe Russia or the Ukraine or the United States or Canada. I don't know. Maybe one of those.
They're all up there, but it's not the one. In fact, I think when I say the one, you're not actually going to be all that surprised. But as it turns out, it's China.
Okay. All right. Yeah.
Which I think has been the number one for a lot of things we've talked about.
Yep.
So China is absolutely growing the most amount of wheat, but we're going to find there's some interesting geographies there because even though they're growing the most amount of wheat, they're not actually exporting a lot of that wheat out. In fact, they're still a net importer of wheat. And so
interesting. Okay.
Very interesting, right? So
I think some of the countries I mentioned are probably net exporters. I'm
exactly.
Guessing. Maybe that's okay.
Exactly. Yep. Right on target. So welcome, listener. We are in part 2 of our episode on bread. Today, we're going to talk a lot about wheat. We're going to get to that in a second. Just to really quickly recap what we talked about in last week's episode. If you haven't listened to it, this will get you basically up to speed. However, there's a lot of information being left out. We talked about sort of how bread was a truly global food that found its way into almost every single culture, sort of independently from each other. We talked about the history of bread and how it goes back tens of thousands of years at least, and how each culture sort of appears to have its own take on bread, such as the Ethiopian injera bread, and to the indigenous Americans' influence on bread by way of corn, to China's steamed buns, right? And this is sort of excluding all of the European innovations around bread, which is obviously very a lot happening there as well. We talked about the Industrial Revolution and its impact on bread and all this stuff, and sort of the manufacturing processing of milling, and sort of how this brings in industry to sort of an industry or into a process that was very laborious prior to this. And so, and then we sort of ended the episode on some of the religious and cultural uses of bread that are maybe a little bit more common, sort of maybe a lighthearted way to end the episode. So again, super high level. If you're interested in any of what I just said, you haven't listened to part 1, go back and listen to part 1. A lot of really fun.
You could still listen to this part first and you'd be okay, I think.
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, because really for today's episode, what we're going to be talking about is basically sort of what our introduction question is about, which is the modern era of bread, and more specifically wheat and sort of its impact on bread, right? So, there might be some history here and there today, but largely we're looking at basically, what's happening today. We're going to talk a lot about wheat, and I think it's worth, maybe calling out that in the lead up to this episode, Hunter and I talked about whether this was going to be geography as bread or geography as wheat, because they're kind of synonymous with each other. And ultimately, I think we went with
in the United States, they're synonymous. So.
Exactly. Within the United States, they're synonymous, but there's a lot of tie-ins with each other. They interact with a lot of each other. Ultimately, geography as bread is a little bit more of an interesting topic, which is why we went with it. But we're going to be talking a lot about wheat today. So let's go ahead and just dive right into what is wheat, right? So, Hunter, do you want to talk a little bit about what wheat is?
Well, wheat is a grain, right? And I think it's originally from Southwest Asia, what would be Iraq today, and was one of the first grains to be domesticated by people, and turned into bread and other things. And it's, as you mentioned, it's become very diffuse throughout the world, right? So it's spread from the Fertile Crescent through the Mediterranean to Europe, but also the different parts of Asia to North America, South America. And so it is, I think after rice, it's one of the top grown crops in the world.
Right. Yeah. There's actually a really fun map that exists out there somewhere as I was doing my research that basically shows where it was historically grown, which was in sort of the Iraq, modern day Iraq area, Fertile Crescent area, and is now dispersed out into every single continent aside from obviously Antarctica, where it's, that would be pretty impressive if wheat was grown in Antarctica. but every other continent is growing some form of wheat. And there are several types of wheat, right? So there are, hard wheats, this would be sort of red and whites, or soft. There's durum, there's emmer. Each has its own sort of unique characteristics and uses. So hard wheats have higher protein content and are typically used for breads and pasta. Soft wheats are typically used for pastries and other baked goods, that kind of thing. And so generally the primary uses of wheat, obviously what we're talking about a lot in this episode is the food production aspect of it, right? So primary use of wheat is for human consumption. It's milled into flour, makes a variety of foods, including bread and pasta and all this other stuff. Covered a lot of that already. Won't spend too much time on it. But there's some other uses as well, right? Wheat is not exclusively for human consumption. Can also be used very heavily in the in terms of like animal feed, right? So feeding of cows and pigs and that kind of stuff, which is often then used for human consumption, the meat from those animals. But a lot of sort of what we grow ultimately goes towards animal feed and to support that industry. Wheat can also be used for alcohol production, right? So wheat is a key ingredient in many beers and some types of whiskey and vodka. Again, that would be human consumption, but sort of a different level.
So white beer tradition from Belgium or from Germany, for example, are wheat beers. And Hefeweizen, exactly. Right? Like that's the
Hefeweizen, yeah. Hefeweizen would be the one that I most commonly associate with wheat, because it's very also commonly known as a wheat beer. Very good too. And finally, another sort of maybe semi-major use of wheat would be as a biofuel, which is maybe not as common as corn or sugarcane, but wheat can be used in production to create stuff like ethanol, which I think at one point was a little bit more prominent within fuel creation. I don't know how prominent it is today within the United States, at least.
When I think of animal feed and biofuel, I think of corn a lot. So this just maybe another reminder that we'll have to do an episode on corn at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so let's talk a little bit about wheat as sort of a commodity, because that's kind of what it is today. And so high level, what is a commodity? Commodities come in sort of many forms, including grains, energy products, and metals. We talked a lot about commodities when we were talking about coffee. Coffee is a commodity. And this means that the prices are determined by fundamental factors such as supply and demand, which changes as economic events unfold and sort of trigger sort of waves of buying and selling. And so this is all happening on a what would be called a stock market, in which case for wheat specifically is traded on the Chicago Board of Trade, which is a stock market specifically for commodities that was established in 1848. And so I think broadly, as we're thinking about stocks and stock markets and all this stuff, I think certainly for those of us in the U.S., our heads probably go to New York City, right? Which has the New York City Stock Exchange, has the Dow Industrial Stock Exchange, the NASDAQ, has all of these different things. It's sort of very iconic in that way. But Chicago has a huge hand in this as well, right? And particularly within this commodity market. And so the Chicago Board of Trade, apparently, from my research, stipulates that one wheat contract is for 5,000 bushels and states what grade of wheat can be used to satisfy the contract. And so I didn't dive too deeply into this. From my reading, a contract is it would be as similar as a share. And so each share, even though these aren't companies, would equate to 5,000 bushels. And then that translates into, as of this week, and I don't know what time you're listening to this, but as of this week, one contract is about $650-ish US dollars per 5,000 bushels. So one contract, $650.
So commodity is really something that is traded on an open market. Right?
Exactly.
So it's something that we've reframed the way that we think about. In coffee, we talked about that as well. And it's something that instead of being thought of as a grain or food or something like that, becomes much more connected to money and markets. And that's, commodity is a way of thinking about things.
Yeah. And we've talked a lot about this with respect to Industrial Revolution in the last week's episode, but it's another way in which the local control over sort of what maybe a farmer is producing is removed from them, right? Farmers can't set their own, even within a region, they can't set their own price for wheat. Now it's being determined by this market based in Chicago, and maybe they're based in South America somewhere, and they're still maybe adhering to sort of this Chicago Board of Trade, or CBOT is what I commonly saw it referred to as an acronym. And so this price is essentially set, and they sort of lose that control, and that comes with, I think, a lot of disadvantages for a lot of people around the world. But as a commodity, obviously, it is very profitable for a lot of people as well, and which means that there are places that grow a lot of it, not only for profit, but also for food. And so we talked a little bit about this already, but let's run through sort of who maybe are some of the major players in terms of wheat growing. And so much of the data that I'm going to run through right now is from the 2020 to 2021 planting season. I do have access to 2022 data, but I specifically want to use this data because it allows for some fun comparisons with regards to imports and exports of wheat. So I have 2020, 2021 data for that as well. I don't have 2022. Data for that. Yeah. Was that? Yeah.
Pretty recent still.
Pretty recent still, yeah. Although there has been a major event that does upend some of this. So
absolutely.
We'll talk a little bit about that. But we talked about this, right in the beginning of the episode. I asked Hunter what country grew the most amount of wheat, and it is China. So as of 2020, China was the leading wheat producer with about 134.3 million metric tons of wheat produced. So that's pretty significant. That's significantly more than number two, which would be India, at only 108 million metric tons of wheat. Still a lot of wheat, but China's clearly growing a lot more. Just to run through the list pretty quickly, we're not going to go through each one except for maybe a couple, but that would be followed by Russia at third, United States at fourth, France at fifth, Canada, Australia, Pakistan, Ukraine, and then Germany. And that rounds out our top 10. Now, there was a couple in there that might have been pretty interesting to hear based on recent news, and that would be Russia and Ukraine. And so again, we're going to talk a little bit more about sort of this specific event, and because it's had such an impact on wheat and wheat production in the world very recently. But as of 2020 or 2021, I should say, Russia produced around 85.3 million metric tons of wheat per year for that year, I should say, and Ukraine produced around 25.4 million metric tons. So quite a discrepancy between them. This has definitely changed today. There's a lot that is different from then to now, based on sort of the events that are happening there. The U.S., for their part, as of 2020, produced approximately 49.7 million metric tons, which I think if you asked a lot of people within the United States, they would probably assume that the U.S. grew and produced the most amount of wheat in the world, just given sort of maybe some of the historical contexts that we often associate with our country, talking about the breadbasket region of the United States. So it's kind of interesting for me to see that it still produces a lot, but it's significantly lower than both China and India and Russia. So with that said, let's talk about maybe some of the exporters and importers of wheat, because I think this is where we get some of our interesting geographies and sort of some of the interesting stories around here. So those who grow the most wheat might not actually be the same as whether they export that wheat or still need to import more wheat. So track with me a little bit here, but because there's going to be some interesting stuff here. But just to run through some of the largest exporters. So as of 2020, the largest exporters of wheat were Russia at basically $9.9 billion, followed by Canada, then the United States, then France, and then Ukraine. And so
that was my initial list, pretty much. Yeah,
basically, you nailed the exporters list.
Okay.
Yeah. Now, what you're probably not hearing, well, what you're obviously not hearing there is two countries that you might have expected based on how much they produce, which is China and India. From what I could tell, they do not export very much wheat at all. And there's a reason for that, right? China and India have a massive population amongst the two of them. So even though they're growing a lot more wheat, and they're growing a lot more of everything, right? Very likely. a lot of that has to go towards internal consumption as well. And so, obviously, as I rounded that out, Russia, Canada, United States, France, Ukraine, that last one, Ukraine, is a huge issue in the world right now because they're obviously not exporting that much wheat today as they were in 2020. Now, if we go to importers, sort of some of the largest importers of wheat were Egypt at $5.9 billion of imports, China at $3.1 billion, followed by Turkey, Indonesia, and then I thought this was interesting, Italy at $2 billion. That would round out our top 5 importers.
Okay.
And so what's really interesting, because this is all highly tracked, is that we can sort of see some of these very specific trade flows from exporters to importers. So who's buying whose wheat, right? So
okay, interesting.
I plucked out a few interesting trends that I saw. So Egypt is buying the most amount of wheat overall. And again, I don't think that should be surprising if you know anything about the topography of Egypt. Most of their civilization or their country, its population is surrounded or hugs very closely to the Nile River. They have a lot of land, but not a lot of arable land because of that. And they have a large population as well. And so Egypt needs to import a lot of wheat in order to feed its countries. So as of 2020, they were buying the bulk of their wheat from both Russia and Ukraine.
Okay.
We don't have data today. So I have no idea how this has changed, but it almost assuredly has.
Right.
My guess is that Egypt is buying their wheat from someplace else, predominantly, or at least maybe from one more than the other. Apparently, Egypt did used to buy most of its wheat from Poland rather than Russia, but has since switched. So over the last 5 to 10 years, they gravitated from buying most of their wheat from Poland to buying most from Russia. And Poland has since gone on to basically sell most of its wheat to Saudi Arabia instead. So just sort of some interesting sort of, geopolitical patterns maybe there. I'd be curious to know, if I had this data today, whether Egypt was now gone back to buying a lot of wheat from Poland, or if that wheat is already spoken for. Obviously, there's been a little bit of less wheat overall. So Canada sells the bulk of their wheat to China, which I thought was interesting. Okay. Now, if you look at China and India sort of side by side, Canada, obviously a very large country with a very small population relative to its size. China, a really large country, but also with a really large population. So you can sort of see how that might make sense. I did think it was really interesting, though, given the recent sort of geopolitical issues arising between the two countries. They have a pretty antagonistic relationship at the moment. So it's kind of interesting to know that China is in some capacity, and I'm sure Canada as well, still dependent on each other. But France has also recently started selling a lot of wheat to China as well. So maybe this is a sign that China is looking to diversify sort of its sources of wheat. And, as I'm saying this, Egypt is buying from other countries too, and China is buying from other countries too. This is just where they're getting the bulk of their wheat.
Okay.
And then finally, I thought this was just kind of interesting. I don't really necessarily have an interesting story to go with this, but that most of the United States export of wheat goes to Indonesia, which, again, I don't have anything on that. I saw it and I was like, oh, interesting. I wonder, how that happened, because you would think that Indonesia would be able to get it from, I don't know, Australia or something.
Indonesia, one of the largest populations in the world, is like maybe number 4 on the list or something like that. So a lot of people.
Right. Well, I guess the reason why, I assumed Australia is because, knowing Australia, which is, again, another really large country, but also with sort of a small population. It's not one of the largest exporters, but they do export a lot of wheat. And so, obviously the geographic closeness doesn't always play into it, but it does make for sort of a natural, before you have this data, you sort of think like, oh, obviously they would probably be getting their wheat from someplace, like Australia. And that's just not the case here. Instead, it's coming from the United States.
How it works. That's right.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's how our minds like to work, but I would say very rarely is that actually how it works. Okay, so we just ran through a bunch of data on wheat as a commodity and sort of the prices and exports and all that fun stuff. Let's jump to a quick ad break, and then we're going to come back and talk about more of these sort of events and sort of, maybe bread as a global staple and wheat as a global staple.
We'll be right back.
And we are back. We've been talking a lot about wheat as a commodity throughout this episode. Obviously, in part one, we talked a lot about bread as sort of historic. That's sort of moved into sort of maybe how is wheat and bread sort of interacting with the world today. And so let's talk a little bit more about this idea of bread as, and maybe wheat as well still gets factored into this, but really as sort of a global staple, because out of this sort of conversation, we're going to get at a couple of sort of maybe key events that have happened recently. Actually, one that's still historic, one that's very recent, that sort of helps tease out maybe the importance of this crop and this food to people. And so, I think it's debatable on whether bread is truly a global staple. Obviously, there are communities that don't engage with bread as much as others, and so they aren't as reliant on it. That said, I would say that a lot of countries and places around the world do rely on it pretty heavily. And so for centuries, bread has been a staple in many cultures around the world, kind of due to its nutritious properties, right? So we haven't really talked about bread as sort of a nutritional device, but obviously nutrition, even though this is a geography podcast, nutrition is, kind of what helps a lot of civilizations grow and prosper and all this kind of stuff, because if your people aren't healthy, then they're probably not going to reproduce as much. And as it turns out, bread is really an excellent source of carbohydrates, which is the body's primary energy source. Carbohydrates being that word that, maybe 5, 10, or 15 years ago was, a negative in terms of nutrition, people who wanted to lose weight. And, maybe that has a little bit of truth in it, but is also very important for humans overall. And so,
yeah, I mean, if your entire diet is carbohydrates, not a great thing. But for most people, that's an important section of your diet.
Absolutely, yeah, and it's because bread is rich in carbohydrates, which is energy, but it's also a really good source of dietary fiber, especially whole grain bread, which adds sort of digestion, helps maintain a healthy weight. And this is, I would argue, and this is what I've seen argued around, is why civilizations have sort of naturally gravitated towards bread as a food source, because nutritionally it was very good for people and it was relatively cheap. Now, obviously, making a flour at certain points was expensive, that kind of stuff, but it was still cheaper than some of the other alternatives. So it was just a very sort of dense carbohydrate fiber food that people could sustain themselves on to a certain degree. And so last episode, we talked quite a bit about white bread, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about white bread at this point, because as we're talking about nutrition, this sort of conversation around white bread is going to lead us to sort of maybe a big change, particularly for people, I think, in the United States in terms of what their bread looks, feels, and tastes like. Okay. And so white bread. So, right. Actually, Hunter, lead us through sort of a discussion on white bread again.
So white bread is made from wheat flour, which has been highly processed. So the bran and germ layers have been removed through the milling process, and it's refined into white flour. And often, because so much has been stripped from it, it's fortified. So that's something. The idea is, if it's a staple crop, right, and if you add more nutrition to it, if people are eating it anyways, you can get more nutrition that way. So this fortification comes in the form of vitamin B and iron and things like that.
Exactly. Yeah. This fortification or enrichment process is kind of artificial, and yeah, it's the whole point is to try and make this sort of bread that doesn't have a lot of health or nutritional qualities, especially as it goes through some of these processes, brings it to a level of nutrition that maybe is a little bit more acceptable to people. Again, I mentioned this last week, but if I said Wonder Bread, especially to our U.S. audience here, you would probably instantly know what kind of bread I'm talking about when I'm referencing white bread. But the reason for this brief discussion again on white bread is because it leads us to talking about the impact of additives on bread. And so additives are all of these extra things that go into our food. And it's not just bread, it's a lot of different foods, but bread in particular has a lot of additives added into it that do things like help preserve shelf life, help improve, quote unquote, the texture, or help improve, quote unquote, the taste, whether these things actually do that or not. It certainly has become a thing that maybe people expect in certain regions around the world, particularly, I would say, in the US. And so the big one there, Hunter, is preservatives, because
Right.
that's so integral to a lot of the consumer culture within the United States and how things are
Being
moved
able to
around.
mass produce things and ship it over distances, something, because bread normally, if you leave it around for a few days, will turn into a rock, basically, or,
Right.
it'll start to mold and break down because that's what happens. But a loaf of white bread or bread has preservatives in it has a much longer shelf life and is much more viable to be, for large companies to make it and ship all over the place.
Right. And this is how you get to a place where, your bread making factory can be, for example, here based in Portland, Oregon. And then you could eat Fran's bread in New York City, right? And it has to travel, probably by train over, a week or so to get over there, however long it takes. If there wasn't a preservatives, though, all that bread probably wouldn't last. In fact, it absolutely wouldn't last. So some common preservatives that you might see if you look at the little sort of back label, you can see all the ingredients in there. You might see is calcium propionate and sorbic acid. However, these are often replaced with vinegar and organic or natural breads, as it performs a similar function but is seen as cleaner label ingredient. I don't know if it actually is or not. This is just sort of what's maybe sort of seen as. There's a lot of other sort of additives that go into it. I don't think we necessarily need to go through each one, but there's another big one that I want to sort of talk about, which is sweeteners. So this is something that I would say is probably mostly common within the United States, maybe Canada as well, maybe Mexico. I've heard a lot of some of my friends from Europe complain about our bread, and just how sweet it is. And so sweeteners, they enhance the flavor of bread and help with sort of the browning of bread, sort of that color that sort of indicates to a lot of people, especially Americans, that this is bread. And it can range from regular sugar and high fructose corn syrup to honey, molasses, malt, all this kind of stuff. So it is often said that bread in the United States is very sweet. And I think that if you are in the United States and you've only ever sort of maybe eaten bread here in the United States, or maybe you're just not super, noticing different tastes in bread as you travel abroad. I think most people here probably don't realize it, but our bread is very sweet. In fact, if you look at that back label, you're going to see some form on most breads, some form of high fructose corn syrup or sugar or something that is adding sort of a enhanced sweet taste. And again, going back to sort of the first episode, this is part of the reason why I prefer sourdough, is because sourdough does not have sugar added into it. Typically, I'm not going to say every time, but I don't think I found a brand that has sugar added into sourdough. And yeah, I think that, again, there's a lot of other additives that we can sort of talk about, but this is definitely, geographically, the United States has historically added a lot of additives to its bread, more so than places such as France, for example, right? So at the end of episode 1, we sort of ran through, some countries and their different kinds of bread. And one of them was the French baguette. And we had sort of mentioned sort of offhand that, if you leave that sitting around for, a day or two, it's going to turn into, essentially a baseball bat. And that is for the reason that, again, if you go to France, you go to a supermarket and you buy a loaf of bread, it's probably going to have some variations of some additives in it. But if you go and buy one of these sort of local bakery baked baguettes, it's not going to have these in it. And that's sort of what you're seeing there, is the difference in the shelf life of that bread. And so in the United States, we do a lot of that here. In France, for example, not as much. In other communities, probably varying degrees of additives added. And so with that, let's move a little bit into sort of this idea of sort of famine and food security and famine, right? So wheat and bread has had an incredible impact on not only the development of humans and civilizations, but also in the issues surrounding a lack of food and famine. This would be sort of a more, maybe, I guess, more historically tracked, but more recent phenomenon, especially with how many people have grown on the planet, as well as sort of the where wheat is sort of being agglomerated in a specific region, it becomes much more susceptible to various events that maybe weren't as susceptible earlier on in civilization. So there's a couple of events I want to run through. And the first is the 1930s Dust Bowl event that happened in the United States. So if you're not familiar with it, the term Dust Bowl originally referred to the geographic area affected by dust that happened within sort of that central region of the United States. This would be centered in the Texas Panhandle, Oklahoma Panhandle, and touched adjacent sections of New Mexico, Colorado, and Kansas. At the time, this was a huge area for growing wheat, and that was largely because of the combined effects of World War I and the disruption of the Russian Revolution, which decreased the supply of wheat and other commodity crops and increased agricultural prices. And therefore, American farmers saw this happening and decided that, oh, wheat is a really good thing to grow. And what did they do is they grew it inside what would become this area that we would more commonly refer to as a breadbasket region of the United States today. And this all happened during sort of the 1920s when all of these farms were growing. And this was also during an unusually wet period of time for this region, right? This is sort of a time when, people thought that this was sort of the common weather now for the region because it was happening for so long. And then the 1930s hit. And the 1930s brought a lot of stuff with it, if we're being honest, such as the Great Depression. The 1930s hit and an unusually dry period hit the region, and all of the agriculture that was growing there started to suffer because of it. Much of this was wheat. So the exact decrease in U.S. Wheat production varied from year to year during this Dust Bowl era, but some estimates suggest that wheat yields fell by as much as 50% in some of the hardest hit regions. That's a lot of wheat that's not being grown. And so as a result, wheat prices increased pretty dramatically during this time and created many global issues, kind of similar to what we have seen a little bit play out today. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in a second. So just of note here is that in 2020, a research article from a wide variety of professors and researchers from multiple universities simulated the impact of a second Dust Bowl event in the United States and how it would impact the world. And they found that a 4-year decline in wheat production of the same proportional magnitude that occurred in the Dust Bowl would have a huge impact on wheat supply and reserves in the United States. So by year 4 of the event, U.S. wheat exports fall from 90.5 trillion kcal to before the drought to about 48 million to afterwards. So it exhausts about 94% of its reserves. And we sort of see that propagate throughout the world just due to the U.S.
This is this hypothetical situation that you're
This is this
about,
hypothetical situation. So basically taking the same situation that happened in 1930, applying it to today and as well as the yields of today and seeing how that plays out through the world, right? So they sort of modeled this out.
And it shows how globalized food production has become in a lot of ways. And
well, I'm glad you talked about that.
Because you have a drought, or some kind of natural disaster in one part of the world. And not only does it affect the countries that country is exporting to, but it sends sort of shock waves through the commodities market, as we were talking about before, and affects the price of food throughout the world. And so, even if you don't have a direct trading relationship with another country, that country and other countries will be affected because of the way that the markets are so interconnected.
Exactly. So I'm glad you brought that up because it's going to lead us right into sort of the next event. So this study was in 2020. Obviously, they're predicting an event happening in the U.S. Obviously, they couldn't have predict what's going to happen in 2022, which is the Ukraine-Russian war. And so, if you're living under, if you're not aware, there's a war happening in Ukraine. Russia invaded in February 2022 or March 2022. Taken together, these two countries supply a major share of the world's wheat. But once the war started, much of that ground to a halt. So in Russia, this was largely due to sanctions being placed on them by the United States, Europe, and other countries. A lot of those sanctions eventually were reduced a little bit on wheat specifically to allow for sort of that food to flow out. In Ukraine, it was due to the invasion of Russia and their control over the Black Sea. So wheat was typically exported out through ports in Odessa, for example. Obviously, with that war going on, it was no longer safe to ship things out. the Black Sea. And so in the first couple months after Russia invaded, food prices were quite high and quite volatile. Wheat futures jumped almost 60%. Corn and soybeans were up 15 and 20% in the first week or so. I actually tracked this on the little graph at the CBOT's website. And you could see, during like maybe the first 3, 4, 5-ish months, wheat had jumped pretty high. I think it was at 650 bushels or $650 per bushel per 5,000 bushels today. I think it had jumped to well over 1,000 at that point. And so in the first couple months after Russia invaded, food prices increased dramatically around the world. Luckily, we all kind of got lucky a little bit. So while the initial shock did cause some problems, it was mitigated by a couple of things. So in spring of 2022, the export bans started to ease a little bit, right? So countries removed some of the sanctions on wheat so that wheat could flow out from Russia. And then a tenuous sort of deal between Ukraine and Russia, mediated by Turkey, allowed for some of Ukraine's wheat to come out as well. And so that has helped mitigate a lot of the issues around what this war is doing on that market. It's not fully mitigated, but it definitely helped quite a bit. I'm unclear on, so I have here, so about 25 to 35% of Ukraine's historic wheat production was in areas that are now occupied by Russia. I'm unclear on whether this has been alleviated by Ukraine's recent advances or not. I just don't have that information. But the second event that we sort of all got lucky with was that the wheat crop yields in both the United States and Europe for that year were higher than expected. So, and Russia also had a really good year, right? So apparently Russia had, grew 22% more wheat than expected. And so this was just due to a confluence of weather-related events. And that helped to, stem the issues around, food security and people having a lack of food to eat due to not having enough wheat. So we all kind of got lucky. We'll see how the next few years play out, but it could have been a lot worse. In fact, if we look at the simulation for the Dust Bowl event happening today that the researchers did, that's not entirely dissimilar from what could have been the case for Russia and Ukraine. Because again, if going back to sort of the importers and exporters, so many countries rely on both Ukraine and Russia to basically feed their citizens. And so, I think with that, let's go ahead and just jump to a quick ad break. And then we'll start to wrap up this episode a little bit.
Sounds good. We will return in just a moment.
And we're back. We just ran through sort of a couple really major events, one historic back in the 1930s in the United States with respects to wheat production and that's impact on sort of global food supply. Then we ran through the Russian-Ukraine war and sort of that's sort of impact on global food production as well as wheat exports, because obviously the world, again, is so dependent on this crop to feed a lot of its citizens. But for now, let's go ahead and jump over to sort of what the bread industry looks like today, right? So we've talked a lot about, history and cultures and civilizations and the breads they make. We talked about some key events and sort of countries that, wheat's coming and going. But let's talk about the industry, because corporations are global unto themselves. There's a geography to each one of them, and they are the ones who are actually producing a lot of the food that we eat, right? And so this is kind of where it gets a little hard to figure out the value of bread specifically as an industry. So typically, we'll try and do this with a lot of our commodity episodes where we run through sort of who's producing the most of what and sort of, how much are they making based on, sort of sales and all this kind of stuff, just to have some comparing and contrasting. However, most bread brands are actually part of a larger corporation or conglomerate. And therefore, unfortunately, the data from their bread sales is not often broken out. And so we're going to try and run through some of the biggest companies. We'll do some sales figures, but there's always going to be this sort of caveat that how much of this is truly from the bread side of it is always a little bit of a question mark. And, unfortunately, unless we lived at or worked at the corporation, we're just not going to have that data. In addition, what I found is that most bread sales are actually private label. And so, or at least here in the US, which means that this would be bread sold under a brand that's owned by a large grocery chain such as Kroger's or Safeway. The bread is actually probably made by one of these other companies we're going to run through. However, again, this means that most of the sales for bread is going underneath sort of these larger grocery chains, which, again, bread would be a fraction of the overall, profit margins of these companies, right? When they're selling, fruits and vegetables and, even things like furniture, that kind of stuff for like Walmart and Target, all that kind of stuff. So, now that said, I do have some high level data. So let's run through some companies right now. So, Hunter, there's one company that we've already talked about a little bit. What is that company that makes a lot of bread products?
Are you talking about Wonder Bread?
No, we're going to talk about Bimbo.
Oh, Bimbo, right? Yeah, right. Yeah, this
Bimbo.
has got to be the biggest. Well, depending on how you count, like you said, because it's difficult to
so hard
pull things apart. But for a company that focuses mostly on baked goods, Bimbo seems to be probably the largest.
Yeah, absolutely. So Grupo Bimbo, this is a Mexico-based company that's, as far as I could tell, is the largest baking company in the world. It's really hard because you just don't know where things are actually coming from. Now, this name might be fairly unfamiliar, I think, to maybe many people in the United States and maybe even Canada. So let's run through maybe some of their actual brands, because they don't actually ship a lot of their stuff here, at least here in the United States, under that Bimbo brand. So their portfolio includes brands such as, well, Bimbo, obviously, but also Entenmann's, Thomas's, and Sara Lee. These are all very prominent brands. Thomas's, right? You can find that's a brand of bagel that you can find in basically any grocery store in the United States. I think it's also like some, English muffins and that kind of stuff. They have baking facilities in over 30 countries around the world. I wasn't able to pinpoint exactly which countries those were, but I think it's probably safe to say that Mexico, United States, and Canada would be on that list.
Yeah, so 215 plants in 34 countries, 9,000 products, over 100 different brands associated with the company, and annual sales of over $15 billion.
Incredible. Yeah. And an absolutely mammoth sort of baking company. And honestly, a lot of their food tends to have a lot of sugar in it, which is fine if that's what you're getting into. And a lot of their, baked goods tend to be sweets of some variety, and they often tend to be very good. Yeah. So let's keep moving down the list. So as we're moving down this list, this isn't, again, because we don't have the figures, of each brand specifically as it relates to bread. This isn't a list necessarily of top 10. This is just sort of how things have sort of bubbled up. So there's another group sort of here. It's called Finsbury Food Group. So this is a leading specialty bakery group based in the UK and supplies a wide range of baked goods, including breads. I don't actually recognize a lot of these breads. And I think that's sort of interesting too, because, and maybe this even happens within regions of the US, but I think as you travel abroad, you're going to see a lot of brands that don't actually cross over. And that doesn't mean that they're not owned by the same company, but it also means that there is a certain amount of localness to each brand and sort of how people are associating themselves with place and sort of specific products, right? And so I have some brands here. Again, I don't recognize these, but Fletcher's, Kara's, and Lee's would be some of the brands associated with this Finsbury Food Group. In 2020, the company reported a revenue of around 300 million pounds. That'd be, I guess in 2020, that would be around $400 million US dollars. I don't know how that's changed today, especially given the currency conversion. Let's move.
It's interesting that the markets, certain companies sell not exclusively, but largely to certain markets. So to back up to look at Bimbo for a second, 30% of their entire market is Mexico. And then 50% is the United States and Canada. So 80% is in those three North American countries. The rest of Latin America, 9.6%. But then if you add Europe, Asia, and Africa, it's 9.5%. So it's not that Bimbo doesn't sell to these other parts of the world, but most of their revenue comes from North America.
Right. Very local. Relative.
Right. And so these other companies, probably there's a similar pattern there as well, where, there's certain regions of the world that they export to in massive amounts, and then other places are much smaller parts of their business profile.
Exactly. Yeah. So let's move over to the eastern side of the world a little bit. This is Yamazaki Baking. It is the largest baking company in Japan. We actually haven't talked about Japan at all in today's episode. I feel like we usually talk about Japan at least once. Yep. I guess this is our one time. And they produce a wide range of products, including sort of bread, sweet buns, and other baked goods. They have a net sales of approximately 10 billion US dollars. And they are probably most known in the US as being, until pretty recently, a co-owner of Nabisco.
Oh,
and so apparently it was a dual partnership between Yamazaki and Mondelez International. I think how it broke down was that Yamazaki, based on my research, was responsible for the Nabisco brand within the Asian markets. And so apparently Mondelez International terminated the joint deal between them in 2014. So they must have had some sort of controlling share in Nabisco, and then started baking independently in Japan under their own sort of baked goods, what have you. And if you're not familiar with Nabisco, they would be responsible for some of the sort of largest, snack brands in the world, right? So Oreo, what's their chocolate chip? Chips Ahoy. Yep. They might be responsible for things like Cheez-Its as well. I'm not entirely sure, but they do a lot of snack goods. And so because of this, Yamazaki no longer being able to make Oreos for the Asian markets, they now make their own Oreo-like cookie called the Noir, which is actually produced at the former Japanese factory that would make the Oreos for the region. So It's kind of interesting if you were to fly to Japan, tomorrow, and you go to the, grocery store there, and you see the two brands of Oreo, which is now made by Mondelez International's, Asian department, and you see the Noir cookie. I would wager that the Noir cookie is probably going to taste like what people from Japan actually more associate with Oreo, whatever the variational difference is, than whatever Mondelez is making, because the processes just can't be the same between two factories. Yamazaki literally just flipped the switch and changed it to a different brand, but it's still the same cookie essentially. Mm-hmm. In 2016, Yamazaki acquired the U.S. company Bakewise Brands, parent of Fleischer's Bagels and Tomcat Bakery. I'm not familiar with either of those brands, but again, maybe this just harkens to maybe some of the localness of what branding means, is what in particular with bread and bakeries. And then let's move over to Flower Foods, and this is probably best known for their the brand that they make, which is Wonder Bread. The bread that the brand that the type of bread that we've talked quite a bit about, which is white bread, sliced bread, that kind of stuff. This U.S. based company operates bakeries across the country. In addition to Wonder Bread, they also own Nature's Own, Tasty Cake, and then most recently, or maybe not most recently, but fairly recently, they purchased the brand Hostess. Hunter, are you familiar with Hostess?
Of course, I'm familiar with the brand Hostess. Yeah.
What do you first think about when you think of Hostess?
I think of cupcakes.
Cupcakes. Okay. I was going to say Twinkie.
Or the Twinkie, right?
Yeah.
But I'm more of a chocolate person.
Yeah.
And you want to talk about preservatives. I taught a class about popular culture in 2007, and we had part of the day dedicated to Twinkies, and a student brought some Twinkies in and distributed them to the class. And I still have one of those Twinkies in my office right now. So this is a Twinkie that's, 16 years old or something like that. And it's still intact. It's remarkable, because that's not supposed to happen for a pastry, but it's a special pastry. But anyways, yeah, Hostess, right?
Yeah, Hostess. So they Flower Foods bought the brand in 2013. Apparently, they closed a bunch of the Hostess bakeries. I was reading up on this, and apparently it was pretty contentious at the time. I think it had a lot to do with...
Hostess basically went away for a while.
Yeah, it went away, right? And I heard that there was like unionization prior to when Flower Foods, and then they sort of like reset, and now there's no unionization at the factories. I'm not 100% sure But I do know that it was pretty contentious at the time when all this was happening.
There's kind of a convoluted history with Hostess and Wonder. So Wonder Bread, for example, was a bread product of the Taggart Baking Company in Indianapolis starting in 1921. And then Continental Baking purchased Taggart in 1925. In the 1930s, Continental Baking became one of the first companies to sell sliced bread on a national level. It started enriching white bread with vitamins and minerals in the 1940s. And then something called Interstate Bakeries Corporation purchased Continental Baking in 1995. And then in 2012, things shifted to around the time that you're talking about. This is the same company that used to have holdings and used to own Hostess, making the cupcakes and Twinkies we were just talking about. And it's interesting that even though Wonder Bread is owned by Flour Foods in the United States, that it's Bimbo that has the right to distribute and sell Wonder Bread in Mexico.
Interesting. I didn't find that in my research. I don't think I dig super deep into.
I did a little extra work on Bimbo because I was kind of fascinated with this brand, and they sell Wonder Bread in Mexico.
Fascinating. Well, here
and also, you know how those Wonder Bread logo has those
like the little dots
and red dots. Those are supposed to be balloons. So I guess somebody who was involved in one of the companies went someplace and there was a huge event, fair or something where there were balloons in the sky. And so this was the image that this person had in their mind. And this was, reduced to these dots, which are now Wonder Bread.
Yeah. And it's very iconic, right? I just pulled up an image on Google, and this is a very iconic look for what almost like bread and Americana, collide with each other. Well, getting back to it. So Flour Foods would go on to purchase a bread called Dave's Killer Bread. I just have to call that out because it's located here.
It's local to here.
Yeah. Local here. Yeah. It's actually from Milwaukee, Oregon, which is a small suburban city of Portland. They would buy that for $275 million. So it was quite a big brand at that time. Dave's Killer Bread, that is. I think most interesting here is that Flour Foods now produces bread at all ends of the spectrum. So Dave's Killer Bread is a, quote unquote, a sort of a natural, very healthy kind of bread, or at least perceived as such. And then Wonder Bread obviously has that perception of sort of additives and white bread and sort of sugar and all that kind of stuff. So I did have here in 2020, the company reported sales of about $4.4 billion. So, quite large, although not quite the size of Bimbo. There's a number of other brands here. I do want to skip over one just for the sake of time, but I want to talk a little bit about Panera Bread because they're a little bit interesting, right? Okay. We talked about these brands of bread, such as Flour and Bimbo, that create these sort of brands that you buy at a grocery store. Panera is different because it is a sort of US-based company that operates as both a kind of a bakery and cafe, and they sell a variety of fresh breads daily. But what's interesting is because they are more of a restaurant, sort of fast casual, fast food kind of service, is that they end up being one of the largest baking operations in the world. And they have over 1,900 bakeries just unto themselves. So if we go up to, what was the notes here? Grupo Bimbo, they have baking facilities in over 30 countries around the world. They don't have as many actual bakeries, independent bakeries, as Panera Bread. So it's kind of a different delivery method than the Grupo Bimbo, which you might associate as being a large baking operation. Panera Bread also, despite not selling directly in stores necessarily, I don't think, maybe in some limited instances, I don't recall seeing them certainly in stores around my area. They still end up being one of the largest bread baking operations in the world. As of 2022, Panera made almost $6 billion. So that would be more than Flour Foods, the makers of Wonder Bread and Hostess and all that kind of stuff. And there's some other companies. There's only one other company I kind of really want to talk about, which is Warburton's, which is another British baking firm. And it's actually one of the most popular bread brands in the UK. And the reason why I wanted to talk a little bit about it is because I think this is one of the few brands that maybe has crossed over culturally a little bit. And I don't know why, but I pulled up a picture of Warburton's, and it's all Warburton's brand bread.
Mm-hmm.
It's not independent, sort of like Grupo Bimbo style or Flower Food style, different brands. It's all Warburton's brand. But I saw it and I was like, oh, I know exactly that brand. So I've seen it in probably cultural media, movies, stuff that's based in Britain or something. It seems to be more of a cultural icon. I thought that was pretty interesting, seeing the sort of Warburton's logo. But overall, they're a pretty small baking operation relative to maybe some of the others. As far as I can tell, in 2019, the company reported a turnover of around 700 million US dollars. So not huge, but again, I just thought seeing that, not actually having Warburton's as a brand here in the United States, seeing that and sort of recognizing it. Obviously, I don't spend a lot of time in the UK myself, so there has to have been some cultural crossover in some capacity. Yeah, I think we can probably move on. Again, there are other companies, maybe just to name a few. Associated British Foods, that'd be another big one. Obviously, based out of the UK. There's this other company. I'm probably gonna mispronounce the name. It's called Arista, something like that. It's a global company with roots in Switzerland and Ireland. Premier Foods, Mondelez International, we talked a little bit about. I wouldn't be surprised if, for example, Nestle had a big hand in sort of baking operations as well.
Yeah, because Nestle is the largest food company in the world.
Right. Yeah. And for that matter, Unilever as well, which we talked about. I think we talked about Nestle and Unilever pretty extensively on our coffee and tea episodes because they both feature prominently in both those markets. But we're probably let's just leave this behind, I think, at this point, and maybe sort of conclude our episode, our two-parter, on maybe some of the climate change impacts on wheat and bread that maybe people are starting to prepare for a little bit. So, just recently, it's just a month or so old, some new research in the Journal of Climate and Atmospheric Science by Aaron Coughlin de Perez out of Tufts University did a study on. They analyzed what would happen if both the U.S. and Chinese wheat growing regions were susceptible to extreme heat and drought events at the same time. And so if we go back to that earlier study about what would happen if a second Dust Bowl happened in the United States, they were just looking at the United States context. And I think what Erin and her team were trying to do is trying to broaden the scope a little bit, knowing sort of climate change and the impacts around the world, and starting to look at this as what happens if things happen at the same time as each other. And so she was pretty clear inside her research as saying she's not predicting, or her models aren't trying to predict that, if this happened in US and China, that this would be the exact same weather phenomenon that's impacting both regions, but rather that there is a not insignificant chance that these two completely separate events could happen at the same time. In fact, I have here, says the findings predict heat waves that happened approximately once every 100 years in 1981 are now likely to happen once every 6 years in the Midwestern US and once every 16 years in Northeastern China. And so when you start having, ratios that small, while it's still pretty insignificant chance that they would cross over, it's not entirely out of the realm of possibility. And so ultimately she predicted, right? So she has some figures here. So as of 2022, China produced 17% of the world's wheat, US produced 6%. So that would be about 23% of the world's wheat taken out of the picture. And so she sort of modeled, okay, what would happen if that does happen on sort of global wheat supplies. And, it's not that different from sort of the same picture that was produced by the second Dust Bowl research team, but just to a higher degree, right? All of a sudden, China, which was still an importer of wheat, for example, is no longer able to sustain itself with its own wheat as well, and needs to now buy wheat from other places. And so when you do that and you have such an economic power, such as the United States and China, maybe trying to buy wheat from other places, that has reverberating consequences for really a lot of the rest of the world, a lot of the countries that maybe don't have as much money.
Well, the prices go up, right? And so it's really the poorest people in each of these countries that will carry the biggest brunt of this situation if this were to happen, if something like this happens, because when prices go up, the people with the least amount of money in, an economic system like we have are going to be able to afford it. And so, this is probably, I don't know if this was talked about in the article, but in my mind, this is, would be one of the big fallouts from a situation like that.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. So they talk a little bit about that as well, just like the overall price increase and sort of, some of the impacts of that. And again, Erin and her team, they modeled it after these two things happening at one time. But I think it's worth calling out that, in her findings, they're predicting that heat waves, that at one point happened once every 100 years, now likely to happen once every 6 years in the US. If we just take that and silo that, and we don't even include China into it, and that just happens once every 6 years in the US, that's a high ratio. That's, that's going to happen, well within sort of, most people's lifespans multiple times. And so how does the US in particular sort of adapt to that sort of reality? Because even if it's just the US's wheat that comes out of the picture, that's going to have, wide ranging impacts for countries such as Indonesia, who currently buys a lot of the US's wheat. And so,
if a lot more resources in the form of water is used to try to rescue some of these crops, and that's less water that's available for other crops. And
exactly.
So it has a knock-on effect for other parts of the food economy, food security. That's part of the story.
Yeah. And this gets outside maybe the bounds of this episode a little bit, but, as these regions do suffer more from like water distress, you're starting to see more calls from, people within these states calling for, water pipelines to be built from the Mississippi, from the Great Lakes, to be able to supply water to these areas. And obviously this creates tension amongst the states that currently have this water, right? Because, you might look at the Great Lakes, for example, and think, wow, that's an infinite amount of water. There's so much abundance there. They can absolutely afford to, send some of it to whatever, the breadbasket of the US where all this wheat is grown, to, make sure that wheat is still flowing. But it's absolutely not infinite. In fact, we can look over at the Aral Sea in Asia and see what happens when you sort of drain a lake for agricultural purposes. And the reality is that the Aral Sea is a shadow of its former self. So it's really interesting.
This all harkens back to our very first episode, which
it really does.
about what happens if water in the southwestern part of the United States goes away.
It really does. Yeah, that's a deep cut from Geography is Everything days. So I think with that, we'll sort of leave this episode. It's been really fun talking about bread for 2 weeks. Hunter, let's run through some pluggables.
I'm Hunter Shobi. I'm a professor of geography at Portland State University. I'm also co-author of Portland is a Cultural Atlas and Upper Left Cities, a Cultural Atlas of San Francisco, Portland, and Seattle, co-authored with David Banis, and co-host of the Geography is Everything podcast, which you are currently listening to.
Yeah, and my name is Geoff Gibson. I'm also co-host of this podcast, Geography is Everything. You can also find me on YouTube. That's youtube.com/@Geography by Geoff. If you're interested in sort of what I'm doing and sort of maybe some of the videos, maybe more micro subjects, you can find all of that content there. That's really fun for me to make. If you want to follow me and Hunter elsewhere, please join us over on Substack. That's geographyiseverything.substack.com, where we do extra stuff. You'll find some bonus episodes. You'll find some articles, that kind of stuff. Starting to think of how we can sort of grow that community and sort of plan for the future around that community. So definitely head on over there if you're interested in that. And then finally, I always just like to make this call, but if you like what you heard today, you enjoyed both these episodes or just this episode, whatever you listened to, you thought it was good, you thought it was informational, please rate and review us on Apple Podcasts or whatever app you use to listen to this podcast, so long as it allows for that option. Not all of them do, but we really appreciate it. It's really, really helpful for us. And I really like seeing those come in. So please do that. And I think next time we are going to tackle the geography of dams, of hydroelectric dams even. Sort of that'll be an interesting one because there's a
not
very
unrelated to today's topic in a way, right?
Yeah.
Because
yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
One of the major reasons for creating dams is for agriculture, and wheat is one of the bread, let's say wheat is one of the major staple crops. So there's a natural link there.
Absolutely. Yeah. So please come back next week and listen to that fun episode. So until next time, see you later.
Thanks for listening.